have to go over there. Go away. You have to go over there. Shoo. No, go back. No, you. Because I have my whole setup over here. Okay. There's your mic.
Hello. Am I recording?
Yeah.
Welcome to the field between. I'm Yasmin.
I'm Ahmed. We got an episode for you today.
We're recording on a Sunday, which is good.
Yeah. Hopefully we'll get this out in time.
Yeah.
But what's going on?
Oh, well, first I'll say we're going to be talking about the book, The Impossible State.
People will get it eventually.
By Wael Hallaq.
The title. We have episode titles,
true.
Descriptions.
I like to say up front what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah, not much is going on. We had a good, busy weekend. We went to a cool arts event, met some really lovely people. It was Ahmed's first chai venture in Pittsburgh, so that was fun.
The chai was very good this time.
The chai was excellent.
Yeah.
Very good iced chai.
Normally I'm very critical of it, but it was good.
And it's cool. It's kind of down to a science now. Like, I remember we used to always be like running around, but it just like was done the night before.
I used to have to consult my spreadsheet a lot.
Yeah. You don't even look at it now, right? You just kind of...
No, I have all the weights memorized.
That's awesome. But yeah, it was a lot of fun. It was nice to like see that kind of creative community here and get a feel for that. And it was at Homestead, which we've talked about before, right outside of Pittsburgh, the place of the Homestead strike. And so that was kind of cool being in a place where that
we were going to do a reading about it, but we never did. But we kind of mentioned it a little bit. Yeah. That was cool to see. It was in a place called the Pump House, which was like a facility that was used to pump water into the steel factories to temper the steel. And it was actually the site of the Homestead battle.
Yep.
Yeah.
Workers, I think, were locked out at that site, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So yeah, really interesting history. Just like the kind of Rust Belt city feel. I mean, it's not just a feel, that's kind of where we are geographically. It means a lot of really interesting spaces, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. Former industrial spaces that are being repurposed in interesting ways.
Yeah, and this one, I guess, based on the info on the plaques and stuff, it seems like there's an organization that was created by Congress and like some of the Allegheny County law making bodies. I don't know which ones exactly, but yeah, they created this organization to just kind of manage these properties. As you know, this one's a community center and it's dedicated to preserving the history of steel.
Yeah,
like big steel.
But it seems like
cool.
It's also, I mean, the placards were all like really critical of the Pinkertons and stuff, so it seems like a good historical project. But yeah, that's pretty much what's up. It's 2 weeks before I teach.
Do you like the Pinkertons?
No, I'm not a huge
They are
fan.
Swedish.
They're Swedish?
Now they are.
Oh, I think you told me that. Yeah.
Yeah,
that's
the
so
Pinkerton
weird.
Corporation is owned by it's a subsidiary of some sort of Swedish
conglomerate. There's a couple of Swedish things I don't like. I don't like horse meat. I don't like the Pinkertons. I don't like how racist Swedes are.
Oh yeah.
I like IKEA. I like ABBA, but I'm selective. Yeah, I like the Kanaka bread crackers that you got us.
Those are disgusting.
Those
are so gross.
They're so lightweight and easy to just like put stuff on. They're really tasty. They're made of rye.
They really
so they have
just
a kind
taste
of like malty flavor.
If you were to not even just cardboard, but if you figured out how to make cardboard as hard as like I don't know, man. Like if you just figured out how to make cardboard harder and more brittle, that's what it would taste like.
I can see how if you didn't grow up with it, it might not be the most appealing thing. But yeah, I really like it.
It's kind of like the there's a Jewish equivalent of this. What is it?
Matzah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's similar.
Yeah. Not my favorite. Do you have any other items from the week?
Mm-mm.
Really? What else did we do?
What did we do last week? We're still getting to know our area. We went and walked by the water. That was really fun in our neighborhood. We saw the like local farmers market.
That was cool. Yeah.
Yeah, I've mostly been just prepping my syllabi. I was doing a summer project, but it fell through. So it's kind of nice to have more room now to get ready for the semester.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Nice. Do you have any items?
I don't.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, man, I gotta carry the whole show over here. Okay. Well, I got a couple.
Okay, that works out.
Let's see. This one I actually just love because it's just some absolute big brain shit.
I was thinking about this all night. So, if it say that it kills 99.99% of bacteria, right? So boom, right? Boom. Okay. I'm using it. Right? Listen to me well. So, Bow, I just killed 99.99%.
All right.
That means there's 0.01% left. Guess what? Use it again. Bitch, that's 0.01%. Now they dead. So now you killed all 100% of your bacteria because you just use it twice.
This is so silly. But sometimes I do like think about numbers like that, and I feel like everyone kind of has thoughts like that sometimes, where you're like, wait, what if?
Really?
You know? Yeah, I don't know. Sometimes, especially with like numbers and percentages, I'm just like, but does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah, but it's that it kills 99.01 or 99.1% of bacteria. It's going to do that every time you use it.
Right. There's still a small
There's still
percentage
0.9
left.
back, you know? And they just say it probably because they legally have to.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, I love that. I was cracking up when I saw it. All right, what else? Oh, this has been popping up on my feed.
On TikTok?
On TikTok. Some excerpts of the PragerU videos. Which I don't know if you've heard, but they are able to kind of show those videos in Florida schools now.
I have heard. Yeah.
I think they're making a push to be able to show them in other places.
We have a new friend who we hung out with this weekend who's from Florida, or moved from Florida. And she was just talking about how stressful it was as an educator. Like, it's insane, even on a college level, the kind of stresses they're feeling. It's so depressing.
Yeah. But this is a lesson about Christopher Columbus.
Great.
Just in time before the Little Italy Festival.
Oh, yeah.
Here.
We got to make sure it's in our calendars.
I think it's like in a week or two.
Yeah. I think it's August 17th.
Okay.
Slavery is as old as time and has taken place in every corner of the world, even amongst the people I just left. Being taken as a slave is better than being killed, no? Before you judge, you must ask yourself, what did the culture and society of the time treat as no big deal? Slavery is...
Oh my God. That's so depressing.
Yeah.
Oh God. Yikes.
So Christopher Columbus doing a little moral relativism.
Yeah, for
there.
real. The man who committed genocide against a whole group of people and sanctioned rape against indigenous people. That's nice.
This is interesting because I feel like there's a section in the reading we're about to discuss that kind of talks about this conception of like this Western conception of time as being just linear progress over time.
Yeah.
Obviously, this is not a new idea or unique to this reading, but it is like a thing that is presented to kids, and especially in these like PragerU videos and in a lot of conservative thought, is that everything that has happened has led to where we are right now, and where we are right now is good, so therefore everything that has happened before must have been good.
Right.
Or
maybe the idea is that like, hey, it was relative, like now we're in a better spot and like, things have progressed.
I've actually, since I saved this a while ago, I've had it in my camera roll for a while, but I've heard even like crazier fucking clips since then, or I've seen them. It's wild. There's one I'll have to show you later. It is actually like a slave talking about how he was just like so thankful that so many people were willing to fight for his rights and slavery.
Is this also Prager?
Yeah, it's a Prager thing, and it's and it's like these animations. First of all, the animations look fucking creepy as fuck because like even if they're standing, they're still like swaying back and forth. I don't know. You just go look it up. But
I think that is that there has been slavery in different time periods. But I think something that like should be stressed, especially in the U.S., is that like the system of chattel slavery in the American South was kind of like, first of all slavery is bad, right? Like if you think about yourself in any other time period, it's like not.
That's the official stance of the podcast.
Yeah, that you would not want, that you would want to occupy. But chattel slavery in the American South was particularly horrific in a way that was really kind of unique. And so that they're not emphasizing that historically is insane. That, for example, if you were born with a parent who was enslaved, that you would also be born into slavery is really historically unique. There was no room at all for social mobility. I mean, the kind of like horrors of the way people were kept, the way they were dehumanized, like everything about it. And obviously, I think everyone who's listening knows this, but yeah, it's really crazy that this is making it seem as if it's a 1-for-1, that like the kind of conditions of serfdom or even conditions of enslavement that might have existed in other parts of the world prior to the colonization of the what we now know as the US would be anything like the system that emerged in the American South is really historically inaccurate and just like stupid. Yeah.
So there's that. Oh,
I've heard about those videos, but I think it's the first one I've actually seen.
shit. Sorry.
Oh, you're good.
What was that?
I've heard about those videos, but I think it's the first one I've actually seen.
Yeah. They're wild. Okay, let's see. I will come back to this one, but I found some, I have some fitness influencers come up on my feed, and is it okay if I share? One of the things that you're trying to do is do push-ups, right?
Yeah.
So I think I found something that will be helpful for you.
No.
Are you ready?
I have a feeling this won't be good.
So the secret to doing 30% more push-ups today is to literally have somebody stand over you with a sledgehammer when you're doing your push-ups and threaten to bash your skull in. And I promise.
Yeah.
Nice.
So how do you feel about that? Do you think that would help?
I think that men will do anything to go viral on the internet. Yeah. I don't think that would help. I'm really not motivated by like negative.
If I stood over you with a sledgehammer and threatened to bash your
I'm
skull
like
in?
so the opposite. I like only like really positive reinforcement. Yeah.
There's this like new strain of like male fitness influencers who I don't know if you've heard of a guy named David Goggins, but I think he was like a former Navy SEAL, and he's been gaining a lot of influence lately. But like his whole thing is, I mean, just like the underlying philosophy of like the Jordan Peterson thing is like, oh, you just have to be a savage if you're a guy. Like you just need to relish in pain and be motivated by pain.
I feel like so few people are motivated by pain. I don't know. A lot of people are motivated to like be in less pain.
That's me. But let's see, I thought I had another thing for you. But what should I end with? This is okay. I can't actually remember if this video is all that interesting, but do you remember Fouseytube?
Yes, I do. I used to really like him, and then he kind of got weird, right? And fell off.
He fell off, yeah. So my parents actually really loved him back in the day when he was on YouTube.
That's kind of cute. I wouldn't expect that.
My mom thought he was hilarious.
But yeah.
But his name is Yusuf Arakat. He's actually Noura?
I think it's
Noura. Is it Noura or Noor?
The Palestinian activist.
Yes.
Yeah. Her brother, right?
Sorry for not remembering. Noura. I think it's Noura.
I forget too, to be honest. Yeah.
This is her brother. They could not be more different.
Yeah.
Yes, you did.
Yeah.
But so yeah, he had this like comedy YouTube channel back in the day.
It was big when we were like in high school, right? I'm trying to remember.
High
I think
school,
that was the time period.
maybe college-ish.
Yeah.
Yes, and then he like dropped off the face of the earth.
I think he had a substance addiction issue.
Yeah, I don't know if that coincided with him just kind of quitting YouTube. Maybe, but I'm not 100% sure. But he kind of like did this thing where he was just like, I'm just giving everything up. I'm going to travel across the country just kind of on the kindness of strangers. Like he wanted to couch surf.
Is he kind of becoming a modern day Sufi ascetic? What was that?
I suppose so, right? Yeah. And then you just didn't hear from him for a while. But recently he's been making a comeback, and he's like posted all these videos of him, a year or so ago when he was just like a little bit, he was chubby, flabby, didn't look well. And now he's like jacked again. And I think he's trying to do some, I don't know if it's like UFC or MMA shit, or boxing, but he's been like building up toward that. And then also kind of making a comeback on Twitch, I think, or some streaming site. Mm-hmm. But he's also been more like overtly religious. He's just like Alhamdulillah in all of his videos, like everything.
Okay. Good for him.
But at the same time, he just kind of, there's some dissonance in his videos.
Okay. Just for context, he used to be very much the kind of like in a sweet,
He's a
playful
fuckboy.
way. Oh, that's not what I was going to say. I was going to say making fun of like immigrant parents and like those dynamics.
Yeah, those were his videos.
Yeah.
Yeah, or he would like dress up as his like mom or something.
Right.
Like that,
It was very
and-
much like the men try and wear a hijab brand of YouTube humor from that era.
But now he's very much a fuckboy, like
Okay.
just an Arab Muslim fuckboy. I don't remember if this video actually captures it, but we'll have to go back and put one in that does. If it doesn't,
I just signed a multi-million-dollar deal that will let me retire my parents and pay off their house and start a non-profit. Alhamdulillah.
They're very white.
Man. Whoa. I promise I'm going to do good with this, man. Wallahi. My name is Yusuf Salah. I God that I'm going to be a world-renowned motivational speaker. Inshallah. I just...
I mean, like he's like hanging out the side of a car on the
Yeah.
highway. He's got his teeth are super white because I think he has these like veneers.
They're a little too white, honestly. It's kind
They're
of blinding.
unnaturally white.
Yeah.
I don't know. Like he's got like other videos of him just like making fun of broke people.
Oh no.
It
Okay.
just like seems to not
It
like
sounds
fit
like
in with the overall like motivational speaker thing. I
Yeah.
think it's still kind of like the you need to pull yourself up by your bootstraps and grind type of
I
motivational
think we're
speaking.
seeing more and more of this kind of like Islamic version of the prosperity gospel, kind of.
Yeah.
Like if you it's very American. Like if you tithe well, or the Muslim equivalent of tithe,
Yeah.
and you pray and you hustle and grind, like you will be financially successful, which is unfortunately not true for a lot of Americans.
Yeah.
Yeah. But
Jihad
I'm glad
actually
he's-
means to grind. If you were to translate it.
It definitely means to struggle. I mean, I guess you could see that as like grinding,
Dude, that's
depending
the
on your
ultimate grind,
perspective.
dude.
You
Yeah.
know, yeah,
The spiritual grind.
yeah. I mean, that is the greater jihad. That's
Yeah.
like the jihad al-nafs, so like the jihad against the spirit. But I'm glad he's not on drugs anymore, or whatever it was he was on. I'm glad that he's healthy, and alhamdulillah.
Yeah.
Hope he finds some peace.
Best of luck.
I enjoyed him back in the day.
Yeah. Okay. Last thing. This is actually like very fresh news that we are breaking.
Okay.
Obama. Gay?
What?
Yes.
All right.
Apparently, and this is for what it's worth, only being reported on like New York Post and Daily Mail.
Of course.
But apparently there is a letter that has surfaced recently, a love letter written by Obama when he was at Occidental to his, I guess, girlfriend at the time,
Okay.
which says that he makes love to men daily, but in his imagination, and that his mind
So this
is
is more Obama bi then, right?
Yeah, I guess I don't know. He says his mind is androgynous. According to a redacted portion of a now notorious 1982 letter obtained by the Post.
I don't trust the Post for shit.
That's where all the great reporting comes out of. The more than 40-year-old letter to an ex-girlfriend recently resurfaced after Obama biographer David Garrow gave a long and winding interview on the one-time commander-in-chief. And this is a quote from the letter. In regard to homosexuality, I must say that I believe in this. I believe this is an attempt to remove oneself from the present, a refusal perhaps to perpetuate the endless farce of earthly life. You see, I make love to men daily, but in the imagination. Obama, then 21, wrote to Alex McNear in November 1982.
Gotcha.
Um,
So very hearsay, who knows? But if Obama had some gay thoughts, good for him.
yeah.
Yeah.
This is also interesting. My mind is androgynous to a great extent, and I hope to make it more so until I can think in terms of people, not women, as opposed to men. But in returning to the body, I see that I have been made a man, and physically in life, I choose to accept that contingency.
I liked Obama's whole ethereal bisexual quote from his memoir that went viral.
So maybe there's something to it.
Who knows? Maybe. I just know that when I was in high school, the Post reporters came to my high school, and we had a teacher who did trips to Cuba, and they just were so hilarious and so nuts. It was like Red Scare on the Upper West Side. They were so all out.
Yeah.
It was a lot of fun. But they've got some great classic headlines that are apparently taught still in journalism schools. What's the one my mom always says? I think it was headless body found in topless yard. I mean, topless bar rather.
Yeah.
They keep things fresh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But you don't think he's a gay Muslim prostitute?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it would be great if he was a gay Muslim. I would love. I mean, is it really great considering what he's done in the world? Hard to say, but it would be fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's funny. This is coming on the back of like the what was it? I feel like there was a guy who got interviewed a while ago. Because he was saying that he like
we were listening to, we were saying this, that he like blew Obama basically,
and that he did it so well that Obama was like on the road, supposed to be campaigning in Iowa, and would drive like 3 hours over.
I think this was Chapo. We were listening when we were driving to New York, and the guy was like, the thing that was funny is that he kept on
Obama's penis.
He kept on naming like the most random like podunk towns in Connecticut that like Obama probably would not have been.
Was it Ohio or
something? I don't remember.
But
it was just like like, and then we were there in bumblefuck town. It was so silly. Yeah.
But I'm sure the conservatives are gonna have a field day with this one soon.
Yeah. I'm so sad. I just noticed I lost my highlights, by the way, but I can still chat, but I did have some stuff highlighted, so that's very sad. Yeah.
Okay. So we're talking about what?
We are talking about The Impossible State, which is a book essentially about the idea that there cannot be an Islamic State, written by a professor at Columbia. I'm teaching an Islamic law class this semester, which is not my specialty. It's something I have a bit of familiarity with, but I'm really excited to like learn more about. And this is one of these kind
of... Hold up. You got to keep that microphone really close to your mouth.
This is one of these Islamic studies books that I just kind of like should have read a long time ago. So we just read the first 2 chapters for today. Didn't delve too deeply into it, but we'll be talking a little bit about it.
Read the first chapter.
You read to page 35 of the PDF, right?
Yeah, it's introduction and chapter.
Yeah, I think that's right. So that's what we're reading and what we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Why don't you start us off?
Sure. So before we get into this kind of premise of there cannot be Islamic nation state with the way that we currently understand nation state and the way that Sharia has been traditionally defined, I thought we should do a little recap. I think that we did a little bit of this conversation on the Queer Muslims episode. What did we call that? Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Mm-hmm. So check that out if you haven't already, because we had some really great conversations there.
You gotta, sorry, you keep moving your head and not the microphone. You gotta keep it pointed at your mouth.
But I think a little bit of background context that's helpful before we get into the text is that at the time of the Prophet Muhammad's life, there wasn't a conception of fiqh or of Islamic jurisprudence the way they developed after his death. And this is like the case with a lot of religious traditions. Things become more standardized and formalized. Different questions emerge after prominent leaders die. Mm-hmm. So the Prophet dies in 632 of the Common Era. And it's not really until the Abbasid Caliphate, which ran from like 750 to 1258, that this kind of idea of Islamic law as a discipline really becomes formalized. So you can kind of go back to the Prophet's time and you can see, examples of his leadership. You can see certainly the core texts that are kind of used to derive fiqh and Sharia. Mm-hmm. But there was not like a commandment from the Prophet that we have like a legal system the way that we now think of, Islamic law. Sharia versus fiqh, this guy just kind of uses the term Sharia, which is fine, but technically I think he's talking more about fiqh, which are like systems of law that we come up with here on earth, whereas Sharia is like the kind of perfect idea of a divine system that does exist, but with our kind of limited human rationality, we're not always going to get perfectly. And I'll use them interchangeably because he sort of does that, but Islamic law draws primarily on Quran and Hadith. So, the Quran is understood by most Muslims to be the direct word of God. Hadith are sayings and actions of the Prophet Muhammad that have kind of been passed through a chain, almost like telephone, of like, he said, she said, they said, the Prophet said X. Mm-hmm. But beyond that, there are a lot of other different legal tools that are used, and different schools have developed that have different takes on those tools. So, there are some schools of Islamic law which are very into the use of analogy, that are very into the use of independent reasoning, and there are other schools of Islamic law that are like, no, just Quran and Hadith. Mm-hmm. And something my students have a tendency to do when I talk about this is to say like, oh, is that like a more liberal school and a more conservative school? But it's not really, because if the Prophet said something very clearly, someone who, for example, and these are generalizations, but someone in the Hanbali school would feel a really strong impulse to follow that. And so would someone in the Hanafi school, but the Hanafis also follow their own precedent. So in a way that kind of just creates moral law, whereas a Hanbali, if it's not in the Quran, if it's not in the Hadith, might be more likely to sort of say like, oh, it's up to individual discretion. So just all of this to say that there's not a clear mapping onto contemporary ideas of conservative or liberal, but there is a diversity of legal tools that are used by these different schools. Today, people will usually say 4 schools of law because there are 4 main Sunni schools that have survived in some form into the present. There's also 1 main Shia school, but historically there have been tons of different schools that have died out.
Right.
So the Zahiri school, I think, was really big in Al-Andalus or Muslim Spain, and that hasn't survived to the present. There's never been just one system of Sharia. There have always been plural legal systems.
Yeah. And these things just become legitimized based on how many followers they gain over time, right?
Yeah,
it's not
completely.
Like
and I think more and more what empires kind of affiliated themselves with different systems, and they became very regionally mapped. And the interesting thing about a context like the U.S., which obviously does not have a system of Sharia, in spite of conservatives who were a little nervous about that at one point, is that you have Muslims from all around the world. And so there's just kind of interesting questions. Traditionally, my understanding is that it was like, hey, it's cool as long as you're following an established system and you're not like mixing systems. But I mean, everyone uses Sheikh Google now. Like everyone is basically Googling stuff. And also people are coming from different traditions, right? So most of Islamic law also is concerned with ritual law, which we wouldn't really understand as law in an American context. So like, how do you pray? You know, how, when can you fast? If you get your period while you're fasting, what does that mean about your fast? That kind of thing. It's not, there are whole parts of Islamic law that are concerned with things like taxation and even some of what we would consider to be criminal law. And I'm not a lawyer, so this is my very basic understanding. But a lot of it really just is about ritual. And that way it's very similar to, and again, I'm not an expert in this, but I think it's very similar to Jewish law. And that it's mostly concerned with matters of ritual purity and not what we would consider to be really law in an American sense of what we now think of as a legal system.
Really? So not like divorce and stuff like that?
Yeah,
or
no, that's totally covered. You're right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. There is overlap, but the bulk of fatwas, like classically, were concerned with like ritual. Because if you think about also not having, and we'll get into this with the book, not having a state with the apparatus that states now have.
Yeah.
That was more of what people I think were concerned about of getting out of what we would now would think of as like legal specialists, was like, how do I know that my prayers count? You know what I mean? How do I know like how to fast properly?
Yeah. It was more concerned with the moral. Yeah. And that's what he says is like the difference between that sort of, I guess, like what's different about Sharia from like a Western sort of legal structure, which it starts with the moral question and then everything follows from that. Right.
But you're right.
Like
that
that's
also
the
does
paradigm,
end up including things like divorce and things that we would consider law. Yeah.
Yep.
In an American context.
Yeah.
The only other thing I was going to say, and sorry, I'm talking for a bit, is that so before the nation state, there was a class of people called the ulama, and the ulama still exist today, but they don't really have the same status in society. And that was kind of the learned scholarly class. And some of those folks were specialists of law. And so it was really kind of people who were like well educated, who were really focused on really specific questions.
Yeah.
And there's something beautiful about that in terms of like specialization. But it's not very democratic, which students also find kind of, it rubs them the wrong way. There, for many time periods and contexts, there wasn't this idea of like, oh, anyone could interpret the Quran for themselves.
Right.
That's like a really modern idea. I mean, I guess there's this idea of like any Muslim can connect to God. It really depends on what strain of thought we're talking about. You know, there's no like clergy in Islam necessarily. Depends on your branch, obviously. But yeah, so they had a lot of power in society, a lot of moral influence. And so leaders often would call on them. And then you have muftis and qadis, and this is something I'm still trying to figure out, honestly. It seems like it depended a little bit on the context, but I think generally speaking, muftis are people who were learned in the law, who would issue like opinions, and then qadis were like the actual jurists who like ruled on that basis. So I think that qadis were probably mostly consulting work that muftis had like put out there, which is interesting because I'm trying to think if there's even a parallel for that in an American legal context, but I feel like that's the same role here, right? Maybe it's like jurists versus lawyers a little bit. I don't know if there's a way to parallel that. Like lawyers, no, I don't think that works.
I mean, it's kind of, the Supreme Court kind of does that a little bit, where it is interpreting and then issuing opinions.
But then we all have to follow it, right? So it's kind of like the same role.
But then different states and, you know, different, I guess, circuits or whatever, like, I have to figure out if, like, exactly what that looks like.
Yeah, that might be a little bit of a parallel.
Yeah.
Yeah, but let's get into the text. So yeah, it just starts off by saying the argument of this book is fairly simple. The Islamic State, judged by any standard definition of what the modern state represents, is both an impossibility and a contradiction in terms.
So what does that mean? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it means that he's saying that people keep on trying to make Sharia happen and they keep on trying to do it through state apparatuses, but it's just not working. It's not working in Iran. It's not working. I don't know if he mentions Pakistan, but there's been some attempts to do this in Pakistan, especially under General Zia, who was an asshole.
Egypt, Pakistan, Iran.
He mentions the Muslim Brotherhood. Yeah.
And these are all, like kind of post-colonial states.
Right. Yeah, so I think that's his main idea. There are some basically the nation state is an inheritance of colonialism, and I totally agree with him on that. One thing I had a little bit of a hard time tracking, or I wasn't sure if I was agreeing with. So he says we're all part of modernity, which I think is true. I hate when people talk about things that are more or less modern. We all exist in the same time period. We're experiencing things differently depending on our access to materials, depending on whatever, but we're all in modernity together,
Mm-hmm.
But he kind of sort of is invoking this idea of the Muslim world, which doesn't share this legacy of the post-Enlightenment project, which doesn't share the legacy of colonialism in the same way. But one, I'm very biased on this because of my training. I've worked a lot with Jamil Aydin, and so I don't know that there is one distinctive Muslim world. What does that mean for us in the U.S. who are Muslim?
Mm-hmm.
There are historical parallels that we could turn to. I was about to say, what could we do with then non-Muslims and Muslim majority context, but I know that the Ottoman Empire had a lot of legal thought that was produced actually about religious minorities, so that exists to an extent. But I hear what he's saying, that there is a kind of legacy of thought that we can claim as a paradigm, and I think that's beautiful, and I like that idea. Or I wasn't sure if I agree with it. So he, on the one hand, he has this contention that hey, we are all living in modernity together.
Sure.
And I track with that.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's this also idea of well, the Muslim world doesn't have the same kind of intellectual inheritance, or it shouldn't have to. But all nation states, and I guess this is probably what he's getting to, is the issue is nation states. All nation states were born from colonialism.
Yeah.
I mean, the British East India Company kind of really shapes the idea of the kind of contemporary British state at the same time as which it kind of creates what become, India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh.
Mm-hmm.
And nation states are really built off of systems of capital. They were made to carve out resources exploitatively under capitalist systems, and that's kind of the world that we inherit now. And I think we use a lot of fancy language to make it seem better, but I think nation states inherently are just kind of a tool of capital, meant to kind of extract resources for people in power, and they have kind of ways of controlling that. Of course there were bad empires in the past, but the kind of apparatuses of control that nation states have, I think, are much more sophisticated than anything that's existed before. And technology is also made that we can all kind of sort of feel like we belong to one entity. Whereas if you were living in the Abbasid Empire, for example, and you were pretty far from the capital of Baghdad, you might have been vaguely aware that you were in the Abbasid Empire, but it's not quite the same thing as living in rural North Carolina. You still know that you're in the US, you know what I mean? Even if you're far from peripheries of power.
Uh-huh.
That's a little bit of a long soliloquy, but basically, I don't know that Muslims are any different than other groups of people. I'm not sure if there is a Muslim world. I think we're all just dealing with a nation state context, so I was a little bit confused by that point.
I mean, I think you're right, is that is his point, is that in trying to answer the two questions that he brings up earlier, right? So he says, the proposition that a modern Islamic state is impossible and even a contradiction in terms contains at least two hidden questions that must be stated at the outset. If the state is inconceivable, then one might ask, how did Muslims, having in the past commanded great civilization and built many empires, rule themselves? And what form of governance did they practice? And second, with this impossibility in mind, what type of political rule are Muslims presently adopting or likely to adopt in the future? The second part of the latter question, with the predictions it involves, is not integral to our argument and constitutes a separate field of inquiry. So I think what he's saying is that that is a good question to ask, but yeah, as he kind of goes through the books, maybe it's like less relevant to the question, because he does say that we can't really, to know what like Sharia would look like or what would have to be undone in order for us to be able to like observe some form of Sharia governance. We can't look to the recent past or modernity to be able to like even start to answer that, really. And I may be like overstating that point. I don't know.
No, I think you're right.
Because as he says, and this is something that, you know, I think if you like read, I was thinking a lot of like Fanon whenever he was like talking about it, because a lot of these post-colonial states, even though they're officially, you know, like not colonized anymore, what ends up happening is that it creates this like, you know, bourgeois or petty bourgeois class that then learns from the colonizers as they're on their way out, and then they, you know, rise to the top of the structure that's been created in, you know, under colonialism by perpetuating the same mechanisms of colonialism, right? And so in these post-colonial Muslim nations, you actually just have, you know, things that mimic a Western style legal system,
Right.
Which is incompatible with what we think Sharia should be, you know?
Right. Yeah, I totally agree with that reading. And I think that in most nation states, there is a mix on the books of most Muslim majority nation states that purport to use Sharia. There's a mix of colonial law and of whatever kind of school of thought was most popular there. So I know in Morocco, it's like French colonial law mixed with Maliki law. In Pakistan, it's like Hanafi mixed with British colonial law.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's like a bit of a mishmash. And also is the trickiness of like, you know, you had people who were going to muftis asking like, you know, does this invalidate my prayer? And then you had people who were going to qadis, and you had people who were going to jurists. You had, you know, leaders of empire who were legitimizing their decisions based off of jurists. But because you just didn't really have the nation state structure, like the question of how that translates is one that I think we have to be more thoughtful about. You know what I mean? Like, there is no real legal equivalent of me seeking an opinion. It's more of like, and this, a lot of scholars have argued this, it makes Islam more of an ethical framework or a question, right? Like, especially living as a religious minority, I'm not actually really looking for an apparatus that is telling other people around me how to pray, but I might have questions about how to pray, you know?
Yeah.
Particularly because I taught myself how to pray from YouTube, so I have like a mishmash of styles. Like, I probably should pick a madhab.
Yeah.
So it's a fair question. It's a real one. You know, how do I pray in a way that I feel that I am, not that I feel, but that I, you know, that is legitimate, that will be accepted. But that's not a question that like the state is interested in. And then there's questions. I mean, this was a big thing with us with our legal contract, with our Islamic marriage. And I think we may have talked about this a little bit, but there have been some pushes to make nikahs legally binding. And there's ways that you can do that, but you have to kind of be thoughtful about involving different parts of law. Because if we had only been legally married and we got, you know, God forbid, one of us passed away, that would not be recognized by the state, right? We wouldn't be able to inherit each other's property. We wouldn't be able to, like, you know, who would take care of our cat? Like, you know, like, it's not legally protective. And unfortunately, there's not enough education about that in some circles. And there are a lot of people who get really hurt by that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've got a quote here. One thing I appreciate is that he says that, you know, this kind of idea of a Muslim moral paradigm as being a guiding force for Muslims is seen as nostalgic. And he kind of points out that that's only something that is used essentially for like non-European subjects. So I think is so true. Like when people are like, you know, ancient Greece, which he points out is not a clear line, and I agree with him, to like what is now the contemporary nation state project or ideas of the West. It's not seen as nostalgic. It's seen as like, you know, valorous ideas that have persisted throughout time.
Yeah.
So I think there's nothing wrong with turning to your tradition. It's just a question of like what that process of translation looks like.
Actually, let me start from the beginning of that paragraph because I think it puts it in better context.
Yeah.
He says, the political, legal, and cultural struggles of today's Muslims stem from a certain measure of dissonance between their moral and cultural aspirations on the one hand, and the moral realities of a modern world on the other. realities with which they must live, but that were not of their own making. In one sense, the entirety of this book seeks to substantiate this claim. The West, by which I mean here mainly Euro-America, lives somewhat more comfortably in the present that locates itself within a historical process that has been of its own creation. What do you think about that?
This is the thing that I'm finding contradiction in, but I'm having a hard time articulating.
Uh-huh.
I don't think that the U.S. is a product of like the Enlightenment. I don't think that I think that the U.S. is a product of like imperialism and colonialism.
Yeah.
And so, you know, in as much as like the quote unquote founding fathers had their kind of grand ideas of what a nation state was, like, I mean, the U.S. was also built off of the transatlantic slave trade, which was like a
right.
global project. You know, like, I don't think that we are I think that we're uniquely benefiting from the global order.
Yeah.
I don't think that we're uniquely a product of it. And I don't know if we feel like
kinda.
I don't think so.
I mean, the U.S. at some point was a colony of Britain, and it adopted a lot of its legal systems and lawmaking and a lot of that from England.
Right. Yeah. No, I totally agree with that. But I'm saying I think that the whole world is a product of colonization. I don't know that we are uniquely so, or that we are.
But I think what he's saying is that these countries find less contradiction in modernity than like Muslims and Muslim majority nations.
That's what I'm not sure if is true. I think that if you are doing well in the U.S., I mean, it's a very kind of like theoretical conversation, but I think if you are financially well off in the U.S. and if you, you know, look like what we purport the ideal American citizen to look like in a lot of ways, but a lot of American citizens feel a lot of contradictions and uncomfort being in the U.S. state. And similarly, like a lot of Egyptians that had inherited the colonial mantle, you know, or even like, I'm not going to play favorites, like my family who definitely inherited the colonial mantle in Pakistan, you know, and work as government bureaucrats. Yeah, I don't think that was necessarily more profound of a contradiction. You know what I mean? It's just a matter of like who has power and who has resources.
But I think if you're trying to reconcile, maybe what he's saying is if you're trying to reconcile like a spiritual or moral framework.
Yeah, that's true.
Within that context, like it's just hard to do, even if you're someone who is upper class, upper middle, right? Like it's not like a class question. It's more of, do you suffer a dissonance between your moral framework and
the nation state?
The, I guess, overriding governing bodies and mechanisms.
Yeah, that helps me a little bit. That's a good way of phrasing it. But don't we all suffer from that dissonance, like whether or not we're Muslim? Like,
not everyone. I mean, some people will look at, I mean, I think more so recently, I think a lot of people have been, there seems to be more of an understanding that laws and legal systems and enforcements are actually just made up and predicated on a monopolization of state violence. And furthermore, I think are just like unevenly enforced, right? So you can have a law against theft and robbery, but you go and steal, you know, like arrest someone for stealing like a loose cigarette or selling a loose cigarette or whatever.
Right.
And then a bank can steal billions of
fine,
dollars overnight, and then no one gets arrested, right? I think people, I agree with you. I think people do suffer a dissonance, but I think they look at it and say that's wrong no matter who's looking at it.
Yeah.
But there's no moral framework with which they're approaching it that is at odds with it. You know what I'm saying? Like, does that make sense?
Yeah.
There is just like an innate morality, which I guess is different than saying like, I have this spiritual moral framework that I'm trying to live by. And this system is offensive to that, not just to my own personal sense of what is right and wrong.
And an example that's making this feel like more resonant for me, and the way you're framing it is super helpful, is like abortion, I guess. Like, I don't really believe in the American legal system as like a good or a bad. I think it's just a tool that more often than not is not used well.
Yeah.
Especially when you think about like enforcement of law. But like, yeah, as much as possible, if it grants me protections, I will fight for that, you know. But I don't think of it, and I know some people really do feel this way, and I think that's totally fair, and I feel for them, but I don't feel like let down by an idea of the US by the undoing of those protections. I just think like, fuck, that's scary for me and for people I care about. And like, if I ever have a kid who's, you know, got a uterus, that's a bummer. I have to think about where I want to live. Like, you know, it feels like a very practical question that is horrific in its implications, but I know that for some people they feel a real loss of like an idea of something that was meant to protect them, an idea of progress. But it is kind of like, there have been actually a professor in my department is doing some really cool research about Jewish legal challenges to abortion, because like it does kind of raise the question again of like, what about my ethical framework that is supposedly protected by the First Amendment? You know, what about like, even if they're not seen as legal in an American court, what about like my right to my understanding of when life begins, you know? And it's not protected in a minority context in the United States.
I'll be right back. I need to actually go get my notes for this.
Okay. I have a good song you should insert here called Sharia Law by the Comunas.
Yeah. Okay.
I am an Islamist. I am the Antichrist. Most squares can make most wanted lists, but my, how I stay in style. God chased me out of my mother's womb. My grim was in sin. Before through the fence above my red toy boat, so I devised a plan for heads to roll. Sharia law. Sharia law. In the USA, Sharia law. Sharia law. In the USA, Sharia law. In the USA, Sharia law. In the
but
should I eat the cherries into the microphone?
Yeah, you should.
A good ASMR.
I think, yeah. So he says Muslims have two problems to resolve, right? And this is maybe what you're getting at. There's the ontological fact of the state, which, correct me if I'm wrong, is just a fancy way of saying the fact that the state exists.
Yeah.
And then
yeah,
the deontological fact, deontological meaning, you know, what is right and wrong.
I think that's it, right?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
I kind of forget.
It's a field just concerned with what
morality.
Is right and wrong. Morality, yeah. The deontological fact of bringing about some sort of Sharia governance. And any attempt to kind of really resolve that contradiction between the two of an Islamic state would require kind of like a massive top to bottom change of like a world political economy.
That sounds really right.
So it's just like, it's kind of, this is why he says, you know, it's an impossibility to, you know, try to think about what an Islamic state would be.
Yeah, I think for me it's kind of helpful to kind of game out or imagine, and I think it would have to be like a state without police. Like I think that the whole idea of there's no compulsion in religion, the whole idea of like what was considered within the realm of most empires and most leaders of empire. I don't think it works when you have these kind of technologies of law enforcement and of surveillance, you know?
Sure. But that's I mean, so he gets into like the discussion of like paradigms. And I also don't know if I necessarily agreed with that premise, and it's probably because I just didn't understand it enough, or we should probably actually read the whole book before we offer critiques. But you know, like he thinks about the paradigm in the sense that, you know, something becomes a paradigm when it is kind of at the center of everything, and in trying to solve that paradigmatic problem, or everything else becomes subsidiary to that, and those subsidiary things are solved when you solve the central problem. And so he gives what is the example he gives of like technological advancement?
This is kind of around where he's talking about secularization and the fact that you know, there just wasn't the same conception of the secular before the nation state. You couldn't like be like Muslim in some ways, like you know, it kind of organically permeated more facets of your life. Yeah.
What did you think about that?
I don't know. It's kind of a both end, which is a little paradoxical. I think that one, I don't think that secularism is free from religion, and I'm sure he knows that. There's been a lot of really great scholarship on this. I mean, a lot of the kind of way that the nation state is framed is very religious and very kind of like something you have to believe in without seeing, and it's probably influenced by histories of religion. And then there's also the fact that like in the US itself, a lot of like supposedly Christian moral values are used to kind of influence our law and our way of being. Sorry, what were you gonna say?
I mean, it can be a religion, but is it a religion? I mean, I think the difference is it doesn't begin from like a moral framework or like concerned with deontological
right? The kind of
questions.
Like the kind of fear that people have over, I think it's because the project is unraveling a little bit. Like the fear that people have over like, you know, what does it mean if we talk about the founding fathers having slaves? Like there is this kind of idea of like almost like prophets, right? Who started us? There's a lot of myth making.
Yeah, no. It can be like like a religious thing.
Yeah.
But it is different from something like Sharia or Islam in that it is not. It's like first order question is not concerned with what is moral or good, right? So it is concerned with how does the nation state grow, and it says, you know, everything follows from that. So then that must be good, right? So we have this conception. That's how we get this conception of like history, where everything that's happened up until now that's grown the nation state is justified because
that's how we got to our present.
That's how we got to our present moment, as opposed to an alternative structure, which may have, you know, which if it kind of was taken from the, you know, you start from the question of how do we do the best for people, and one thing that he also brings up is that he gives like 3 examples of things that, you know, were to kind of like make his argument that these typical Western structures of governance are incompatible with anything like Sharia, and so therefore you cannot have an Islamic state, is because the modern nation state is destroying the world, right? Like in a capitalist world, it's, you know, the only way that it grows or expands is through the destruction of the environment, and that is something that is like very, you know, if your primary concern was how do we honor the world and people, like you would never have arrived at the modern nation state.
For sure.
You know?
Yeah.
Does that, I don't know if that makes sense.
No, it definitely makes sense.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's a bit of a chicken egg situation. Like we could say like the US was created for the, you know, basically for capital, you know, for like production's sake. And I think that's totally true. But I think that there was always from the very beginning a kind of idea of like the nation on a hill, the, you know, there's ideas of manifest destiny. There were a lot of religious ideas about why the US should be. And I think people really believe in it still. I mean, that's kind of why you have all these conservatives that are so nervous, I guess, and liberals too, that feel really invested in this idea of the nation state as a force for good ultimately. And this kind of, I mean, there's even some really beautiful traditions that have come out of that are positive, even if I don't share their moral optimism. I was going to say like Martin Luther King, like the moral arc of the universe bends towards justice. Like, you know, I'm not sure if that's true, but I think it's a really motivating idea that's beautiful and that created good in the world. And so I think that there is a kind of moral teleology there, an idea that we're working towards something better. I was going to say also, I don't want to give the impression, and I'm sure that he wouldn't either, the author, that like all Islamic rulers and qadis and muftis in the past were like gems, like, you know. Oh no. But I think that they didn't have the same tools and technology for like mass destruction that we now have. I think that is kind of the key difference. Less there, you know. So I don't know that like saying that you're guided by morality is any kind of guarantee, but it is a great place to start. Why not if you're going to start somewhere? But I mean, even like Ibn Hanbal, who like founded, he didn't mean to found, but his students and successors eventually came up with the School of Law, which is now like kind of followed in like the Gulf and Saudi. He was like killed by an Abbasid ruler, basically because he was getting too much of a following, but on some kind of like theological premise. So like, you know, there was still infighting back in the day. And to be fair, I guess that's where he's kind of getting out this idea of paradigm. He's not saying like there will be a perfect world or there ever was a perfect world, but like what would be an ideal paradigm and a kind of ideal moral place for us to start with. And there is a key difference I think you were getting at, which is like even if you understand that Sharia is not perfect, that it is diverse in its implementation and even in its theorizing, if you are drawing on the Quran and Hadith, then certainly the Quran, again, is kind of this idea of like the word of God. And there is no equivalent of that, I guess, in an American legal system, even if you really are like a textualist who believes that we should do whatever the founding fathers thought. That's not quite the same thing as being like, hey, this is the word of God. So that's different.
Yeah.
Yeah. I read a review or two of this because I was just kind of curious where it was situated. And it was really praised because it's just like an interesting question that hadn't been framed in this way before. So that's really great that he brought that to light. And especially, and I really appreciate that he doesn't give this airtime, but especially with like ISIS claiming to be an Islamic state, just raises interesting questions about what it would even look like to have an Islamic state. One thing that did get a little bit of critique or pushback was that he's kind of, and he, to be fair, he says that he's doing this for the sake of an argument, which is fair enough, but he is sort of simplifying a kind of complex and varied history of Islamic legal jurisprudence. And he's also simplifying in some ways like European history a little bit. But I guess to be fair, it's like a large theory, so that makes sense. But just kind of interesting because he first became known as a scholar for writing against this idea that the gates of ijtihad had closed. Ijtihad comes from like the root jahada or jihad, to struggle. And it's a legal tool where you get to use your own rationality. And there's been this idea that's kind of pervasive that like after the 12th century, legal scholars just like stopped doing original legal analysis in Islam. Like Muslim legal scholars were just kind of using old analysis and recycling it, which is ridiculous because even if they called themselves traditionalists, new questions arose like coffee, that they had to figure out, like, is this permissible? And of course they had to use analogy. Of course they had to use independent reasoning. Should women drive, right?
Yeah.
This woman should not, but others should be able to.
Yeah.
But so he had an article basically arguing that like this is kind of an Orientalist question. I don't know if he used exactly those terms, but basically like the gates of ijtihad never closed. The Islamic legal tradition is dynamic and it's always changing. And then in this book, there seems to be a kind of like a sort of, it sort of renders the pre-nation state Islamic tradition as somewhat flat or like somewhat something that could be plugged into a paradigm when in reality it probably had a lot of local variance. And we're talking about like a huge expanse of time for like pre-19th century.
Yeah.
But I mean, at the other time, I love a good theory. I think it's still helpful to conceptualize because it is a question that a lot of people feel invested in.
Yeah.
Yeah. But there's sort of an interesting tension.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely, it's very dense. I would be interested though to kind of continue reading into the later chapters and
I initially kind of
more.
was wondering if I could assign this to undergrads. I definitely could not.
Yeah, especially not in an introductory class.
Yeah.
It's
but it got me thinking, so I appreciated that.
Yeah.
And I feel more confident now saying if someone asked me like, should there be an Islamic legal state, I wouldn't have thought to have said like nation states are immoral, but I kind of like that reverse Uno card. I think that's smart and true. Like,
well, there's like a contradiction in that.
Like I do appreciate that. Like I feel like more confident in saying like, instead of being like, well, I don't know, I could just be like, I don't know if there should be nation states, which I really do believe. So I think that's interesting. Yeah, like Islamic ethically, the way I understand it, I don't know that makes sense. So I really buy that part of the argument, which is the bulk of the argument, I think.
And then to be able to answer that question, you have to wrestle with like a massive history of colonialism and post-colonial, structures and things like that. So. Let's see, what else did you have anything else highlighted?
No, I lost my highlights, sadly. So some of my finer notes are gone, but
here's a little quote on, because we were talking about just kind of like the teleology of time. He says, "The doctrine of progress is the brainchild and handmaiden of the modern conception of history, made to encompass all human experience from the beginning of time, whenever that may have been. History was endowed with a new structure by the Enlightenment, whereas in many cultures, history is structured eschatologically, providing a narrative of moral choices intended to instruct." Dogmatic and lacking adherence to reality, the theory of progress is founded on the assumption that time has a homogeneous teleological structure, that this structure is inevitable, and that therefore the earliest phases of history were preparatory for the later phases, which were in turn simply the means to reach the intended summit of real human progress. Western modernity, of real human progress, Western modernity. As Adorno observed, this structure of time was not merely a logical requirement for the theory of progress. Rather, it effectively justified and validated the events and developments of the present because these latter were regarded as predetermined and therefore inevitable. Yet, there's another important dimension to this notion of predetermination, namely, that all history, itself intended to prepare for the dawn of modernity, is insufficiently developed and, in Hegelian and Comtean terms, not yet mature.
That's what I mean by, and I'm a little biased because in religious studies we always do this. We're like, is football religion? Is Disney World religion? But there is something that's really interesting about the project of modernity that really did copy religion. It copied what came before it, I think. It almost is this idea of like heaven on earth, right? Like, it's not that different than kind of an eschatology of like, how do we get to heaven? It's like, but it's kind of like a man-made thing of like, well, we created the best possible times that could ever have been. Like, it's still teleological, I guess, but just like now within our current time. Does that make sense? Like we created, like we are the apex of everything that's come before.
Yeah.
Whereas before the apex was supposed to be like after you died, I guess, you know. If you were an Abrahamic faith, at least, or, you know, a faith of the conception of the afterlife, which not all faiths have, but yeah. Wait, there was something else that you read. Did you have thoughts about that? There's something else that you read that made me think of something.
No, just reading it to kind of give context to
Conceptions of time.
Yeah. And how that is kind of something that's like very deeply embedded in the kind of the psyche of everyone, right? I think it's like good to call out.
Yeah. And I think
that's what I was trying to say. Like, this is what I was trying to refer to when I was showing you that PragerU video. Is that
no, there's a definite connection for sure.
Implicit in showing those sorts of videos, like the PragerU videos, is that slavery is excusable or justifiable because it led to America, or that other video that I didn't play, but I told you about, right? Like, where the slave was saying like, oh, America's the only country that like, could have ended slavery and fought for my rights. And it's just like this totally, first of all, like incorrect history, but itself is, justifying slavery existing because it was inevitable that the U.S., this morally righteous nation, was going to find part of itself by abolishing slavery, so it needed to have slavery in order to overcome slavery.
That the suffering that everyone who was enslaved is somehow justified.
Because it's more about the identity of the nation than it is about the people,
Yeah. Or, I mean, it's really, that's the thing also, is that like nation states are really kind of playing off of like certain people's identities. Like, it's sort of like implicit in that, like, who got to thrive because of this, not everyone. I mean, you can have better nation state narratives, I think, that like, there are people worth championing, but they often were people who were against the nation state, I was going to say, this is, there are things that progress with time. I'm not like such a relativist. Like, of course, like we have better access to medicine. It's not like I think that no progress happens, or that I'm not happy to be alive today. But I think, one, there's too much pressure to kind of see everything as inevitably progressing. And two, there's a kind of desire to sort of narrativize or storytell, which is natural, but not everything is moving in one direction. And this is actually something I struggled with Marxism when I first was starting to understand the idea of like, civilizations will move through phases, and there will be the most advanced, societies will be the first ones to transition into communism. And then eventually, like, less and less government intervention will be necessary because society will be functioning so well. But I think after talking to like Kylie and other people and you, I kind of have realized that the critique of Marxism can still stand without having to, and that in fact it seems like most contemporary Marxists actually like are not as concerned or invested in that kind of teleology. I kind of see Marxism, or really like any kind of, not any, and it's something that Ahmed's much stronger on than me, but as I'm kind of putting my thoughts together.
You know what I'm stronger on than you?
The mic.
Putting my mic to my damn mouth. Right. Okay.
But I was going to say, I think like, basically, I think that critiques of capital are really important, and they can have some solutions, but it helps me to realize I didn't have to like kind of fixate on this, like, well, I don't know that like time is going to work in this way, and that seems very much like a clear inheritance of the Enlightenment and the time period that this came out of. But that's not like, I don't have to throw out the rest of the theory because of that. That's kind of an aside. But just
there's like a dogmatic view of it, which is like, Marxism is a political ideology versus it's a tool. Marxism is like a tradition of analysis.
Yeah, and a dynamic tradition that's still developing. Yeah. It's kind of like, honestly, again, thinking about Marxism as a religion versus thinking versus thinking about it as a living, breathing tradition that can be adapted and,
Yeah. I think that's right.
Yeah.
But yeah, I feel like I definitely struggled through a lot of this. I was a little bit distracted. Yeah. But it's very dense. I think I would actually I need to print it out because I can't really read on a screen very well. But, I found myself like wanting to click into the footnotes a lot, and there's like a lot that's referenced just in this short, introduction and chapter that we read, that I feel like in order to really understand what he's saying, you have to kind of have at least familiarity with all of the people he's referencing.
That's smart. Yeah.
So I think it would, to really give this book its a fair review or fair shake,
Definitely,
you kind of have to engage with it.
But I think it's fair to say that like we learned a lot from it, or it created conversation. So that's always a good thing to say, even if like the writing style was not always, at least for myself, like the way that I would seek to write. I appreciated the arguments.
Well, definitely not written for a broad audience, right? Like it is just very much for like
which I think at some point he says that it is meant to be. So
oh really?
Yeah, like early on.
Oops.
But you know what, to be fair, I think he's maybe trying to get these ideas out there and then hoping other people will like implement them,
And again, we did read like introduction and chapter, so he's like trying to just put
get all the
this
main arcs out there
and maybe in the following chapters it's like, I think it's a lot more focused. So
I've heard he's an amazing lecturer. I know people have taken courses with him and really enjoyed them.
Very knowledgeable.
Yeah,
if he ever wants to come on the podcast, more than welcome.
Or to my class. I mean, that
open
would be
invitation.
Cool.
Yeah, you should reach out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My end note review: there shouldn't be no states.
There shouldn't be no states.
There should be no states.
There should be no states.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. I don't know what comes next, but I think that something new is going to come. I don't think we can go back to empires, but I think there needs to be a post-state world at some point. It'll probably be necessitated by climate change, honestly, at one point. I kind of hope I'm not here for the transition. Transitions are rough.
Yeah.
But I wish everybody well.
I think it's going to be...
maybe smaller scale societies.
Space stations.
Oh, okay.
Where the rich people live.
Great.
It's like Elysium.
Uh-huh.
And then just kind of a Mad Max sort of situation here, where instead of cities or states, we just have roving gangs. And you just have to...
That's depressing, Ahmed.
Become one of the roving gangs.
I'm going to go a more utopic route. I'm going to say that we're going to have small-scale societies, and they'll be more democratic because they'll be smaller scale.
Uh-huh.
And, the Earth will come back, and that'll be a good time. But the transition will be rough. I'll say that. I don't know why I decided suddenly that I should be a historical predictor of civilization, but this book really empowered me to put forth some.
But do you think any of these small scale societies will have Sharia like governance?
Maybe, yeah, because I think that's the thing. Like, I think it depends. If they get rid of like surveillance and shit, yeah. Sorry, I know we're towards the end, but I wanted to talk about that I thought is helpful. There's a branch of Islamic law called the hudud crimes, and they're like the worst crimes, and they're named in the Quran. I don't know if they're called hudud crimes in the Quran. I don't think so, but they've been like termed that way by legal scholars.
Murder.
And some of them, right? Murder. Yeah, exactly. But some of them translate into a modern day context, and some feel a little rough, which is like why in Saudi when you steal, you get like your hand chopped off.
Yeah.
So but one of them is extramarital sex or zina.
Oops.
We got married. I don't think it counts. but the like the threshold traditionally has been very high. Like it has to have 4 witnesses. But I kind of feel like in a modern day context, like what does that mean? Like what if there's like photos? Like is that a witness? You know what I mean? Like what if you have like...
Well, but now in the age of AI, anyone could doctor a photo of someone having sex and be like, yo.
If you have like a camera on the front of your... Like, you know, I just feel like it's a new question, which is interesting. Or like a new... I guess the barriers to proving stuff are different than they used to be. Like before, if 4 people witnessed you fucking someone that was not your husband or wife, you're kind of fucking in public. You're kind of trying to disrupt the social order. You know what I mean? Like you're really messing up there.
My argument would be that perception is mediated.
It's an inside joke. It is though. You're right.
Yeah.
It's mediated. All right, let's cut it. Bye, y'all.
Bye.